But now we're going to go ahead and switch gears, and we're going to hear from our next presenter. We are going to be hearing from Steve Detweiler, who's from the county office, the Miami-Dade County Office of Emergency Management. He's going to be talking to us about Florida emergency services and how do we work together. And then we're going to have a nice Q&A period afterwards. So without further ado, here is Steve.
Can everyone hear me?
Talk loud.
So starting off, my name is Steve Detweiler. Obviously, I'm with Miami-Dade Emergency Management. I've been in emergency management for about 15 years. I've worked at federal level as well as about 8-10 years here in Florida and also in Virginia and California. I'm responsible here for the public-private partnership, which also includes working with our art and cultural community and also working on our recovery program and also our infrastructure program. So I'll be talking about in terms of how you interact with people like me before a disaster, because you really don't want to be exchanging business cards during the disaster. That usually doesn't end well. So what do we have here in Florida? Obviously, most of you guys have probably already been through hurricanes, but we have like a lot of different things that happen here. So we have, floods. We had just floods down here not too long ago, and we're still dealing with some of those issues. We have the Zika virus now. We have hurricanes. We have tornadoes. We have sinkholes. We have wildfires. We have building fires. We have terrorism. There's a lot of different hazards that we kind of face here in South Florida, and especially in Florida in general. But there's also a lot of other hazards that you face in terms of institutions that you have to also be equally prepared for, just not to mention hurricanes. There's always everybody wants to focus on the hurricanes. They always say, well, we're ready for hurricanes. Well, what about all the other hazards we have? So when you write your plans, you want to make sure that those plans are not only just dealing with the hurricanes, but they're all hazards. They're ready to be adaptable to any kind of situation. And our general thing in terms of emergency management is usually we'll write very detailed plans to say what's going on, and then usually the disaster takes a right turn, and then we have to kind of come up with a new solution. So really when it comes down to it with the plans is it's good to have everything written down, but it's even more important to have those relationships and have the communication with your staff ahead of time, because that's really what's going to carry you through the disaster. So in terms of museums, you have infrastructure disruptions, whether it's a power failure or your building catches on fire, God forbid, active shooter. We're starting to see that more and more. Obviously, we haven't seen anything in terms of museums yet, but knock on wood, we don't have that happen, but that's always a possibility. And then also, water leaks and whatnot, any kind of disruptions to the building. So who are you going to collaborate with? Obviously, there's a lot of us. Emergency management, there's, I'm preferential to emergency management because that's what I do. But there's also fire, police, there's county police, there's fire police, or there's city police, there's different agencies that you get involved. One of the previous presenter mentioned volunteer fire department. Obviously, you're in South Florida. We do have a couple volunteers, but mostly it's career services. So it's career fire department, it's career police officers. So that's usually the groups we deal with down here. So fire rescue, and you'll forgive me, I have a really odd sense of humor, so I always like to put in pictures like that just to keep it a little interesting. But in terms of fire rescue, typically in Florida, for the majority of Florida, you're going to deal with careers, you're still going to deal with some volunteers. It can be either the municipal level or the county level. Municipal level, usually are smaller departments. County level covers the entire county. Here in Miami-Dade County, we actually have several cities that contract with us in terms of fire protection. So City of Doral actually doesn't have their own fire department. They contract with the county to do that. And that's very common across the state. Usually for the fire departments, they're providing mainly fire protection services, emergency medical services, and specialized rescue. So in case you have somebody hanging from your building or you have hazardous materials leak, the fire department would get involved. A lot of times what fire departments answer more than anything else these days is emergency medical calls. That's really the lion's share of their business day. Obviously, fire protection has kind of gone way down in terms of sprinklers in buildings and whatnot, and a lot of the public is a lot more fire safe than they have been in recent decades. But normally for the fire departments, they can provide a lot of different services to you. They can come in and do fire safety checks. They can come in and they can tell you what kind of fire extinguishers you should have in terms of your building. They can also do check your building to see, are you up to code in terms of fire prevention, the fire prevention codes. They can also do training. So if you have like a fire extinguisher over there and say, okay, who actually knows how to work that thing? They can actually come out and actually do training for you and show you actually how to use the fire extinguisher and practice on it so that you guys can go put out a pretend fire and at least get training on doing that. They can also help you with evacuation planning. So if you need to put together an evacuation plan for your buildings, they can actually help you with that. And they can tell you what you should and should not include in the building. They can also do, a lot of times they'll come in and do site visits. So they'll put in like fire prevention plans where usually what it entails is like the company that services that particular area, they'll actually come out and do a walkthrough of the building and that's where it comes into play where you should be with them to say, okay, you cannot spray water here because this is bad and you're going to damage our collection here. So you can actually go through the building with them and tell them where the areas are that you're really concerned about. Maybe you have an area that's positive pressure ventilation, or maybe you have books that are from the 1700s that cannot get wet, and they need to do dry extinguishers in there. So that's where you can walk through with them and tell them, okay, what are some of our more vulnerable areas in terms of our collections. For law enforcement, predominantly most of the law enforcement in the state of Florida is Sheriff's Office. So all 67 counties, well actually all 66 counties have a Sheriff's Office, the exception being Miami-Dade County. We actually have a county police department, and that's actually appointed by the mayor. And we're the only county in the state that does not have a Sheriff's Office. But all of them have Sheriff's Office, so the others all have Sheriff's Office, and they're responsible for law enforcement countywide. Some of the cities will have their own law enforcement. Here in the county, we actually have a couple of cities that contract us out with the county police department and provide police protection as well. So really, if you're really looking for like who your law enforcement is, to go to your sheriff and ask them, and they might say, well, you're covered by the city of Orlando, or you're covered by the city of Doral. So all the counties have police officers or police departments. They can also provide additional resources and assistance, so they can review your facility security plan to say, okay, how do we prevent theft? We had one event that happened during Art Basel. We actually had a piece of artwork that was stolen. So they can actually work with your museum to say, how do we, break down, or how do we kind of reduce risk management in terms of your paintings and in terms of your collection to make sure no one walks away with it. They can also come out and do training in terms of active shooter or terrorism. They'll come out and do crime prevention trainings as well. If you have any kind of specialized patrol, say if you're doing a fundraising gala and you need to have additional patrols in that area, they can actually work with you to say, okay, we can maybe give you a couple off-duty police officers that you can pay for, and they can be at the event, or we'll increase patrols in that particular area to make sure that everything stays safe and whatnot. And then they also do, like I said, crime prevention events. And then on the website is the county sheriff's office list. So if you need to find out who your county sheriff is, you can actually go on that website, and it has a listing of all 66 counties, and it actually has, I think, Miami-Dade on there as well. But that'll give you an idea of where to go to for your sheriff's office. Of course, the emergency management office. Last but not least, is us. All 67 counties have an emergency management office. It's depending. Right now for Miami-Dade County, we're under the fire department, but some of them are under the county manager's office. Some of them are under the sheriff's office, but all of them have it to some degree or another. Some of the county emergency management offices are maybe 2 people, maybe 1 person. Here in Miami-Dade County, we're about 17 people. So we're one of the larger ones in the state, but most of the counties have maybe 2 to 3 people in their office, so they're kind of juggling a couple different things at the time. But they're responsible for overseeing all the preparedness activities and what's going on. Some of the cities actually do have their own emergency management offices, but the counties have jurisdiction. So they're the ones to talk to in terms of getting things done, because they can actually go to the state and say, we need additional resources accordingly. And they can, look, if they have like a very active city program, they'll direct you to the city program if you're under them as well. So we're actually responsible for all the coordination goes on during a disaster. So we're coordinating fire, police, public works, animal control, all that stuff in terms of how the county will respond to a disaster is happening through here. And for those of you guys who are lucky here in South Florida, after this, you'll actually get a tour of our EOC, so you guys can see what we do here. But and of course, if you're up in your own county, you can actually go and meet with your county emergency managers and get a tour of their facilities as well. Most of them, the EOCs, are kind of different. Like obviously at Miami-Dade County. This is actually Miami-Dade County's EOC during one of our exercises, but it's rather big facilities, probably one of the bigger ones in the state. But most of the county EOCs come in all shapes and sizes. Most are hardened structures. The state spent a lot of money a couple years ago basically going to all the counties and making sure they had a hardened structure. It was mainly because of 2004, we had a couple roofs got ripped off the county EOCs. So they went around and they made sure all the county EOCs were hardened structures. So some of them are very large, some of them are very small. It just depends. So it's a good idea to go to them and talk to them. Here in Miami-Dade County, we have a limited number of seating, so the museums actually are represented by our ESF 18 partners, which is our business and industry, and they'll kind of communicate with our art and cultural community to make sure they're informed about it. And then in terms of the emergency management, like what we can provide to the art and cultural community, well, it's a lot of different things actually. We can give you access to grants. There's such a thing called the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. There's also the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program. There's also other grant programs that come out throughout the year that we actually have access to. So if you're a nonprofit museum or you work as part of the government, we can actually work with you to make sure you get access to some of those grants. For mitigation grants, what we normally do is we ask them to be participants on the local mitigation strategy. So it'll give you an opportunity to say, well, we could use some hurricane-resistant windows in our building, and you can actually put a project in. So when we have funding that becomes available, we can push that funding to you and say, it's usually a 75-25% cost share, so 25% comes from you. But you can also make up for that. Say if you're going to do the work all yourself, you can actually, the cost is actually greatly reduced. So that's some of the things we can give you in terms of grants, but we can also help in terms of your writing your emergency management plans. Obviously, when you're writing plans, it's a good idea to kind of run it past us, and we can tell you, well, yeah, that makes sense, or no, you might want to change that accordingly. We also do training and exercising on a regular basis. So whether you want to do training, particularly for your institution, we do training all the time. We're actually coming up on our cycle where we start doing training on a regular basis, and I kind of slightly lose my mind being so busy. But we do normal training, so we have exercises that are going on year-round that we're required to do. And a lot of times we're always asking for other institutions to be part of our exercises. So we might reach out to you and say, hey, we're doing an exercise for terrorism, or we're doing one for hurricanes. You guys want to have a couple injects, and we can throw your way and see how you want to respond to a disaster. For our ESF 18 partners, I actually do an exercise annually, and what we do is we do a webinar where we put together a scenario, we'll see who plays, and we'll actually be on the webinar and a conference call. And it's very similar to this, where we throw out the scenario to them and we give them a couple things to do. The first year we did, we had about 10 people participating. Last year was about 50. So this year, God knows, it'll probably be about 100, which is good. I like that. But we have training and exercising going on year-round, and of course, information is golden. So prior to disaster and after disaster, we send out a ton of information in terms of, what's going on, what the shelters, what roads are open, what roads are closed, do we have evacuation orders in place, do we have the shelters open, where are they at. So there's a lot of information that goes out. And then, of course, there's a website for floridadisaster.org that has all the county emergency management directors on there, and you can reach out to them. And then, of course, the counties are all responsive to the state of Florida. So we have the Florida Division of Emergency Management. They are a state agency directly under the governor. They're responsible for preparing and managing the disaster on the state level. So they deal a lot with the state level organizations, and they all are grouped in terms of the Florida CERT, which is the State Emergency Response Team, and that includes a lot of numerous state agencies, associations, nonprofits. So BAM is part of that as well. There's also the Florida Attraction Association that's part of that. So they all work with them to make sure that the state is informed about what's going on for the art and cultural community, and they can, if they have to bring in additional resources, they have to request additional resources from FEMA, they can do that. So the states are mainly our communicator to FEMA. So they'll work directly with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. If we have a federal declaration, they'll bring in the FEMA staff, and that frees up a lot of federal money in terms of reimbursement after disaster. So working with your partners, some of the kind of key things to do when you have, whether it's the emergency management staff or police or fire departments, good rule of thumb is if you want to start reaching out to your partners, go to your emergency managers first, because they can connect you with all the others, because they deal with the law enforcement, the fire, the public works. We deal with all those players. So go to your emergency manager first, tell them what you want to do, what you're trying to do, if you're writing a plan, or you just want to make touch with them or be part of their team. What we do, and I'll get into this in a little bit, but for the Alliance for Response, we have a new member join. They're put on our listserv, they're also put on an email group, so every time we have something going on, and those are the members that are the Alliance for Response, they probably are rolling their eyes at this point, because I send out a whole heck of a lot of information. For Erica, we were sending out daily situation reports about what was going on, whether or not we had roads closed, whether we had shelters open, what's the state of emergency, how does that affect us, whether or not we're going to do any kind of evacuation. So we were sending out that information on a regular basis. Fortunately, the storm didn't impact us, but we were getting ramped up and providing that information. So when you have, like the first responders or emergency managers come in, designated staff members deal with them. Designated liaison to say, okay, this is our emergency coordinator, this is who you're going to be dealing with. For our folks, in terms of that are part of the Alliance for Response Miami, I have like a primary point of contact I deal with, and those are the people that I keep informed about what's going on. The location and security control center. Do you have a location within your building that has all your security monitors, where your security staff and safety staff are? Most importantly, conduct a walkthrough. I've been fortunate. I've gone through FIU Wilsonia a couple times, and it's one of the advantages of my job. I get free access to museums, and they take me around. But it's a good thing to let them know what you have in terms of your collections and what's the most vulnerable, what are you most concerned about, whatnot. And then providing your institution staff important contact information, like they were saying, in terms of having a little flip book, and that should be on your staff at all times. So if you have something going on, you know who to call. So the night watchman can call management and say, hey, we got a problem here. And then, of course, also tell us what kind of valuable or vulnerable collections you have, any kind of special handling. So in other words, the fire department's not rushing in and have their axes and the hoses all spraying everywhere. They know, okay, don't touch this, or you need to do special handling on this. And then, of course, letting us know about your emergency management plans, your evacuation plans, providing us a copy so we can see those ahead of time. So a little bit in terms of, I'm all right for time, right?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. For the Miami-Dade Public-Private Partnership, this is one of the programs I manage. So this includes our ESF-18, which is our business and industry. That's our response piece of the house. So they deal with during the initial push of disaster. So they're in here coordinating with not only our art and cultural community, but our chambers of commerce, our corporate partners. We have a lot of corporate headquarters that are here, Riders here, Carnival Cruise Line, Norwegian Cruise Line. They all have their headquarters here, so we deal a lot with them. And then recovery support function, economic, which is our recovery portion. They're dealing with how do we get the businesses back up operational after disaster. And the Alliance for Response Miami, and I'll talk about that in a second. The overall goal of the program is to share information resources. So we're always sending out information. We're always encouraging our members to talk amongst themselves to solve the problem. There's only so much the government can do. We really kind of push that back on them to say, work together, work collaboratively to solve the problem. You guys are more the experts than I am, so you're going to be more likely to have an answer than I will. So I talked about this a little bit. ESF 18 is sharing a lot of the information. We're basically, ESF 18 is the kind of the clearinghouse. So they're kind of pushing out everything the county is doing to our partners to make sure they're still informed about what's going on. And then recovery, the RSF economic, we're really talking about them in terms of once the disaster is passed, how do we get the community, how do we get the business community, the art and cultural community back up and operational? What do we need to provide? It's grants from private foundations, or it's small business administration, loans that come into play, or it's emergency bridge loans, which is from the state of Florida. It's more like a step measure to make sure that you can continue to pay your employees and do minimum repairs on your facility or whatnot. And then the Alliance for Response Miami, this is dedicated to building our partnership between the art and cultural community and the first responders and emergency management. We primarily cover Miami-Dade and Monroe County, but anyone in South Florida is actually welcome to join. We always kind of encourage that. So if you're in South Florida and you want to be connected with us about what's going on, we'll happily invite you into the organization. And if anyone's interested in it more, I can provide the website. You can go online and actually fill out an application and send it back to either me or Kim, and we'll welcome you on board. ESF 18 desk, this is some of the information they provide on a regular basis. So it's damage to the road infrastructure, so what road closure we have going on, what's the status of the debris clearance. Biggest thing we always get a question on is power restoration. When's the power going to be turned back on? What county services are open, what county services are closed, whether we have curfews in place, whether we're doing re-entry in terms of the barrier islands, public transportation, drawbridges. Is a whole host of information. You'd be surprised at how much information flows into our EOC on a regular basis. And what I want to do is close with some basic preparedness tips. By no means is this comprehensive, but I try. The one thing I did forget to mention, though, we were talking before about volunteers. One of the things that emergency management does in terms of EOC is we deal with the volunteers. So we always have a huge amount of volunteers coming in, not only from the county and also from the region, but also from out the region. Especially if we have a big disaster. They come in like you would not believe. So one of the things we do is we deal with the volunteers. We actually set up a staging area where we actually credential them and we assign them to anything else or what's going on. So being involved with your emergency management office will actually help you be connected with those volunteers. And you can actually work with your emergency management and say, well, after disaster, we're going to have a need for people who can lift heavy boxes and, do manual labor. So that's something you can kind of put in the ear of your emergency manager and say, we could use some of these volunteers as well. Could you maybe throw some of them our way as well? So we haven't really thought about that before here, but it's something we can always include. In terms of emergency management, we're continuing to kind of stress the art and cultural community. In past years, it hasn't really been a priority or hasn't really come to the attention because we haven't had really a lot of major disasters that really impacted the art and cultural community. So we're kind of we're low here in Florida. We've been like 10 years without a disaster, so knock on wood. So it only takes really one disaster to really ruin your day. So it's better to be prepared now. But in terms of organizational preparedness, the one thing we always encourage is to have a notification system. It can be a phone tree. I've heard more creative suggestions where people have actually created Facebook groups where they can send out Facebook messages. Some of our private sector partners are like multi-million-dollar companies, of course. They have like their own reverse 911 system where they can actually call out to their employees and say, and that gives them the option to saying whether they're okay or not, whether they can come into work or not. That's depending on how much money you have to spend. But that's one thing you can potentially look at. There's actually some other systems out there that are relatively cheap that you can buy. Identify multiple vendors. We talked about this earlier in terms of, don't rely on just one vendor because chances are they're going to go where the money is. And if one of the museums is hit worse than you are, they're going to go there. So always have a backup to that. Maintain your institution's websites and social media accounts. A lot of times when we have disasters, especially for the private sector side, I see this, is they go dark and there's no information going out there. And people are hungry for information, especially during disaster. They'll go on social media, and it hasn't really been a problem down here, but sometimes they'll go on social media and they'll get the wrong information. And we always have to go out there and correct that information. Say, no, this is false, this is not going on right now. So having somebody to maintain your social media sites and continue to update your information. You can also use it as a tool to say, hey, we're in need of volunteers. Can anybody come over to the museum and help us out? And this is what we're looking for. So you can use that as a tool to rally support or rally donors to say, we need a cash infusion to keep our doors open. And then also look after your employees after disaster. We mentioned before about childcare. Childcare is always a big issue. I don't care who you are. That's a big issue for us in Miami-Dade County. The other thing is to maybe think about maybe having one employee designated that they look after all the kids. So your employees are much likely going to easily come in if they know their children are going to be safe, and have somebody like set up a play area, preferably not near like the marble statues, but some place where you can set them aside and have a couple toys in there with them, or maybe throw on a video and just have that. The other thing, and I always encourage this of our institutions down here, is don't just think of yourselves as an island. Reach out to the other fellow institutions. I know a lot of times they're in competition with each other, but talk to them and say, hey, let's pool our resources. We don't have the room, but maybe you guys have the room to maybe do a child care center. And we'll have our employees send their children over there, and you can have your children over there, or maybe even feed their employees and say, hey, we have a cafeteria. We can feed you guys. So why don't you come over here and we'll feed you, and that way you don't have to worry about things. Some of our private sector partners really go all out, and one of our companies actually will bring in, they have like their own disaster team, and they'll do loans, they'll do grants for their employees, they'll do counseling, they'll do fuel in terms of getting back and forth to work. It just depends on how you want to go. The biggest thing I've seen in recent years, and probably the most pressing, is counseling. After disaster, like you were saying before, you're exhausted and it's stress-filled. I mean, it's like that in the field. It's even worse in here during a disaster. It can be a little pressure cooker. I've seen people quit right after the disaster because they just couldn't handle it, and it's understandable. But to provide that counseling and crisis counseling, and we do that all the time. We actually have crisis counselors that we can bring in, and that's the other thing where you can reach out to your emergency management and have them include you as part of their team. That way you have access to those services as well. In terms of exercising your plan, you guys mentioned make sure that you're educating your new staff coming in, but also do regular exercise on the plan. You don't have to do the whole plan. You can do like a brown bag, like a lunch event where everybody gathers around a table, you put together a 5-minute presentation and say, okay, we had something happen, what do we do? And then you go through like everybody's responsibility about what they're doing, and then you evaluate it, and that way you can kind of test the plan to see whether it's working or not. And you can really get creative. I always like having fun, and I throw them like something they didn't expect to make sure that they're, because disasters don't always obey a rule book, so you have to adapt accordingly. And then work with your local emergency managers. We can actually help you put together exercise. I do that all the time in terms of some of our institutions, some of our private sector partners, and kind of give them words of wisdom to say, well, maybe you should include this, or maybe you should do that, or we can incorporate you into this exercise. Evacuation planning, like the picture up there, well, crap, now what do we do? Always have a backup plan. Always be ready with that contingency plan to kind of do that. And then also don't text and evacuate the building. You'd be surprised actually how oftentimes that happens. Somebody's tweeting or Instagramming as they're evacuating the building. Put down your phone and evacuate. I actually had a friend who was Red Cross and he was doing that. I'm like, put down the phone and go. Get out of the building. But in terms of, here's a couple additional resources. These are actually, I stole these from Robin. But these are a couple of resources you can use in terms of putting together a disaster plan. And, activities around your building, just take the employees around and say, where's our nearest fire extinguisher? Where's the nearest exit? To make sure they're oriented to the building itself. And then in terms of curfews, we talked about this briefly. More likely, during disaster, the county is going to throw up curfews. And basically, you're not allowed to usually travel between dusk to dawn unless you have emergency business. There's actually, the state has actually put out guidance on credentialing, which we follow here in Miami-Dade County. And most of the counties actually do follow this. Some of them will have their own systems in terms of hang tags or whatnot. Some of them have their system that's completely different. But it's a good idea to talk to your emergency manager and ask them what they have in place. Some of the inland counties, they really don't have that because they don't have to worry about curfew. They don't have barrier islands they have to worry about. The general rule is to have a corporate identification card, just a name ID card like I have, but also have a letter of authorization. And it can be on, it should be on your institution's letterhead to say this person is an essential employee, this is their duties, this is where they need to report to. So it's something you can hand a law enforcement officer stopping you and saying, I need to get to this location, and this is a letter signed by my leadership that I need to be there. Of course, also have your driver's license with you. You don't want to get stopped without a driver's license. And then, of course, if you are stopped by law enforcement, the key things to remember is be courteous and truthful to the police officer at all times. Don't lie. Tell them the truth. Tell him or her the truth. Have all the necessary documentation. It's like you're pulled over any other time. Driver's license, proof of insurance, proof of registration, your essential employee's number, your company ID. And the police officer tells you, no, you can't come by. You turn around and you go back to where you came from. The one thing I always tell, and this is always the hook for us, is if you're part of ESF 18 or the public-private partnership of Alliance for Response, you go home, but then you get on the phone to our ESF 18 desk and say, hey, we're having a problem getting our employees through, and then we will walk over to the police department or the cities and say, hey, we have these people, they are part of our team, we need to get them through, and then we can work with you to get them access. And most of the other county emergency managers will be the same thing. It gives you an opportunity to be part of their team, and they know you need to get through, and they'll work with you to help you with that.